Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us here today, and welcome to our webinar. We're very excited that you're joining us. We're very excited to share our webinar today, Funders in the Research Ecosystem, Transparency and Efficiency with ORCID and other PIDs with you all. So this is an exciting time to be had. Um, just to kind of quickly remind everyone, the session is being recorded and we will share the recording with you all as well as the slide deck. We will also have a Q&A in the end, so feel free to ask any questions via chat at this time, and then we will have a Q&A once we have our discussion, once our presentations are done. All right, so let's take a look what we have for today. So today we will take a look at the larger picture of funders, ORCID, and other PIDs in the ecosystem. In particular, reducing administrative burden using persistent identifiers and the current landscape of funders using PIDs. Then we will dive into how funders can implement PIDs, looking into the best practices for funders, best practices across the research ecosystem, and next steps for implementing PIDs in funding workflows. Finally, we will have an open forum or an open discussion with Q&A. So thank you all for joining us here today. All right, before we get going, I would like to introduce our team. Many of you already know us. So I'm Paolo Guhildi. I'm the senior strategist for the ORCID US community. We also have Sheila Raymond, lead strategist for research infrastructure programs, and Kayla Rumhit, ORCID US community specialist. We also have our team member from ORCID, Shauna Sadler. Shauna is the engagement manager at ORCID. So thank you for joining us, Shauna. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Neil Thakur, a public health expert. Neil leads strategic change for health systems and research funders to improve outcomes aligned with their vision and mission. He is the founder and principal of Thakur Health Sciences, LLC. Previously, Neil served as the ALS Association's Chief Mission Officer, leading their research, care services, and advocacy programs. He was the chief architect of their plan to make ALS a livable disease by finding new treatments and cures, improving quality of care, and preventing ALS. Prior to joining the association, Neil served in the NIH Office of the Director, where he supported NIH governance and helped make NIH research more open and less burdensome. Neil also served on detail to the U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging and at the VA Office of Research and Development. He holds a PhD in health policy from Yale University School of Public Health. Neil co-authored with Dr. Richard Ikeda an article that we will hear more about today titled Reduce Administrative Research Burden with ORCID and DOI Persistent Digital Identifiers. We would like to also acknowledge the contributions and the work of Dr. Richard Ikeda. Dr. Ikeda, who is sadly no longer with us, was an independent consultant who advised companies and institutions on AI, data management, and data reporting on health technology and research. Rick obtained his PhD from Caltech in bioorganic chemistry and was an assistant professor of chemistry at Georgia Tech. He served 21 years at NIH, rising to the senior executive service as director of the Office of Research Information Systems, where he developed RCDC, or the Research Condition and Disease Categorization, and oversaw ERA Commons, a web-based system for application and institutions to participate in the electronic grant administration process. Brick was an active and passionate advocate for ORCID. He joined ORCID's board in 2016. ORCID's successes, particularly adoption by U.S. researchers, is due in large part to Rick's leadership on ORCID's board. We thank you, Rick. Now I'm going to hand it over to Neil to set the stage of our conversation today.
Thank you, Paolo. Yeah, Rick and I got to talking and working on this project for the Federation for American Scientists about reducing burden in science reporting. And if you go to the next slide, I want to tell you a little bit about how we got here. So when I was at NIH for 13 years, I got to work closely with Rick and on a bunch of different policies and activities to make NIH-funded science more accessible. Things like public access, preprint policy, data sharing policy. And then we wove in some themes into that work to make research easier to share, to reduce burden on our scientists, increase accountability for our system, and as well as to bring all these things together in a coherent way. And so ORCID was a part of that. And so we built ORCID into our BioSketch system, into our Science CV system that creates biosketches for multiple agencies, tried to build that into our grants flow. And we thought about this as a way to help organize ourselves and organize our work. And one of the things that we always wanted to do and never had the chance to at NIH was to build on the infrastructure that ORCID has, that digital object identifiers have, to other research projects, including the grant. So we can reduce the burden of our science processing and reporting system for everyone, for administrators as well as for the scientists, through increasing automation and accuracy, increase compliance with our policies, and start to shift the way we conduct our science, provide better recognition for people who are earlier in their careers, help us understand how to fund science correctly. And to me, this was also always an important exercise, but kind of distant. And then I took a step away from government into the rare disease community, and I got to meet people who said, I've only been given a few years to live because of my illness, and I want you to use research dollars to help me live a little bit, find a cure, or to live a little bit longer to see some milestone in my life. And so I'm faced with someone whose lifespan is shorter than an R01, and then I have to design research programs to help them. And how do I do that? So that meant that all of this work I've been doing to make science more accountable and effective takes on a much greater weight and meaning. And I've been chewing on that ever since. So if you go to the next slide, please. So, I'm sure everyone here is very familiar with the burdens of the federal reporting process and all the strings that come with federal money. And one of the things that the Office of Science Technology Policy has been working on, the Obama administration, both Trump administrations have been working on, is this concept of using unique digital persistent identifiers and tagging them to funding so we can help automate some of these processes. There's a way to do that just with the letter of the letter of the wording, where you just say, here's the funding announcement, here's the notice of award, here's the persistent URL, and that's all you need to do. But that's really not enough to tap onto the full potential that we have. And so that's one of the things I want to talk about. That it's not enough to do this in an ad hoc way. We can do this in a structured way. We can build on the infrastructure that the publishing community has already developed and make this much more effective. So let's talk about that some more. If you go to the next slide, please. So what we really want to do as a funder. Now, I've been a funder for 3 different agencies, the VA, the NIH, ALS Association. We want to figure out what the outputs are for the investment we put in. We want to make sure that the people who we're funding are doing what we need them to do, following all the laws, all the ethical guidelines, and so forth. We want to reduce the time it takes to do that administrative work so people can focus on science. And we really want this to be accurate. And as a funding community, as a community of funders, I don't think we've been doing a great job about that. So I'll talk about that. So the reason why we want to be accurate is we really want to know if we're making our funding decisions correctly, if we're funding the right problems, we're funding in the right way to get the impact we need to solve these very, in some cases, dramatic and human questions about how do you help the person who's sitting in front of you live a longer, fuller life. So I want to go through a couple examples of impact evaluation. If you go to the next slide, please. So here's an example of an evaluation that I helped conduct when I was at the ALS Association. And the little dots here are investigators that were funded by the ALS Association. And then the blue lines between them are their co-author collaborations. So every line is at least one paper, and the more papers they wrote together, the thicker the lines. And so what you see over time is we were funding more people, and the people we were funding were working more closely together. And this is something our board was concerned about. We think everyone's working alone. They're not really collaborating. And we were able to show them pretty obvious proof that that wasn't true. But we were able to figure this out because we hired an outside consulting firm to do this bibliometric work for us. And that was pretty expensive. And this is the first time the ALS Association was able to do an evaluation like this. And I've never seen another ALS group do this because it's too expensive. If you go to the next slide, this is a much easier project to do. It's just simply a count of papers that were authored by association grantees. That's something that we were able to do. We had to back it up with the survey, or rather the evaluators did, because, back in 2014, the data systems were less reliable. But over time, the data systems have gotten more and more reliable. And it's getting easier and easier to see if someone is writing a paper and if that paper is attributed to a different, to one funder or another funder or multiple funders. But this is not a foolproof estimation. And so it's one thing to say, okay, in 2017, so-and-so you authored paper 680 on this list. Thank you, that's great. It's another thing to say, we did a search, we found that you authored this paper 680, you weren't in compliance with our policies, and therefore you owe us a data sharing plan or some kind of report or something like that. That's a different level of accuracy that we're not doing in this particular evaluation. And that has some implications for us. So if you go to the next slide, please. So it's really easy to count products, but it's one thing for someone in an office to count a product and say that a third party did that work with my money, and therefore that product is my responsibility as a funder, and that product is tied with all the strings that come with my money. Now, every funder that I know of has some kind of reporting period where the awardee is responsible to tell us what the products are of that funding. That's time limited. And in a lot of cases, especially for foundations, the money is fast and the products come years after that time limited reporting period is over. And so how do we track? Well, we can make assumptions about how people's funding attributions are based on what they write in the paper, what shows up in the text of the paper. And that's getting easier and easier to do as our text mining software, as our electronic databases and our AI tools get easier and easier to just make that assumption. But that's not the same as the author claiming something. And when the author actually claims, I did this with your money, then they're accepting responsibility for the product and all the strings that come along with the funding that they got. And sometimes they get it wrong. And so we had when I was at NIH, I was responsible for a unit that looked at the compliance with the public access policy to make papers freely available on the internet. And if awardees weren't in compliance, we had to hold up their funding until they brought all the papers into compliance. And I remember this one time we had this center where they claimed the paper of every person who went to their seminar series. So for something like $5 million a year, they were publishing 700 papers. And of course, many of those papers weren't in compliance with the policy, and it looked like we were going to have to delay funding on their center, which we really didn't want to do. And I said, well, how are you so productive? And they said, well, it's just because we have the center and we have the seminar series. And one of the wonderful things about our center is we're able to bring people together through the seminar series, get them to talk about our science, and it sparks all kinds of wonderful collaborations. And that really is part of what the center is about. And of course, cynical me thinks, well, why are we paying for reagents and clinical trials? Why don't we just pay for seminars and have this science coming together? And that's not quite fair because there is something about a really skilled dean, a really skilled department chair, a really skilled center director who does know how to bring people together and needs the incentives of a center and some funding to do that. And then they really can bring about this innovative research. But where's the line? And when people report things, they think it's in their interest and only can only benefit them to be very expansive in their saying that things arose from their money. But that's not true because they are responsible. The money comes with obligations. And when I was working in NIH, those obligations were pretty serious. You had to comply with a bunch of rules, and sometimes that can impact your funding. And so people have to be really careful. And we were able to work with that center, and they were really able to decide that not all 700 of those papers actually arose from the center. They changed their definitions, and we worked with them on that. Things are changing now where you're maybe asked to comply not just with terms and conditions of award, but these different kinds of political and ideological things. It's changing. We don't quite know what they are, and they may be different in different countries and different for different funders. And so the liability for the investigator to over-report, to claim a paper that's not their own because they think it's only to their advantage that a work is theirs and arises from that funding isn't true. There's a lot of risk to claiming a paper inadvertently. On top of that, there is an additional risk where people are going to draw inferences about the work that arises from funding simply by the way that things are written in the paper. And that's getting easier to do erroneously by people who don't understand science, by machines who can draw these inferences. And so that creates a problem for the investigators, but it also creates a problem for the funders. The way we've set up our systems at NIH, centers look like they're very productive, dollar for dollar, relative to other kinds of awards. Is that true? Maybe there's just a bias in how we're collecting the information. I think there's a bias. Centers have staff who pay attention, who follow people around, who do that tracking. The awards last for a long time, so the reporting period is much longer than it is for a short award. So if we're trying to solve a difficult problem of science, a lot of people say, let's do centers. Centers are very productive. They're very innovative, but perhaps not. Perhaps the way we've set up our systems means that we're over reporting in some kinds of research investment strategies and under-reporting in others, and it's distorting how we think about our problem and how we think about solving our problem. So for lots of reasons, and for some new reasons, getting this right and figuring out what is the most effective way to invest is becoming, I think, increasingly important. So if you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So if we were able to structure our linking between an award and a research product in a very concrete way, where the person who's writing the product has a say in that process, I think can do a lot of things for us. It can increase our accuracy. It can reduce the burden for the people who have to report, and it can reduce the burden for the people who have to review the impacts of a project. So we don't have to hire a consultant or do a survey to actually validate the grant award associations that we're looking at, and we can do this in an automatic way. And so the simplest thing to do is to assign a digital object identifier to a grant and then track that digital object identifier for a grant like we track all the other digital object identifiers in the publishing ecosystem, most likely in the bibliography and in the structured data. That's it. That's the concept. It's very easy to do, and this team has worked really hard on simple ways to do that, and they'll talk about that more. But I wanted you to understand the practical stakes that are here, this is not some abstraction. To me, this gets at some very real questions about how we spend our time, how we spend our money, and if we can help the people we're supposed to help. So, Paolo, I think that's my last slide. Yeah. So, basically, what I'm asking for people to do is assign digital object identifiers to their grants, and then to build it onto the persistent identifier infrastructure that we already have. And that requires, I think, publishers to do things a bit differently. We can talk about that. But we really need to stop thinking about science funding as an art and really have a good way to check on ourselves and hold ourselves accountable to the outputs that we get. So there's some resources here, and I think you'll have a copy of the slides. But Paolo and his team will talk more about it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Neil. I really appreciate it. And hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today. It's nice to see you all. So I'm going to quickly talk about the current landscape in the US when it comes to PID adoption and funding. All right, next slide, please. So I'm just going to jump in and give everybody the information that they want. That way it's out of the way. You're not waiting for it. So ORCID has been working with the agencies that Neil and Rick Aikita really got catalyzed and got going. So we've continued that momentum. So thank you, Neil, for all that effort. Hopefully we're doing you proud. We're working very closely with a few of these agencies that I have listed here. So first and foremost is Department of Energy. They actually host a US government consortium for ORCID, and we have 26 members. So those are different government agencies that are members of that consortium and are using different integrations with ORCID to exchange data. So that way the systems do connect all their persistent identifiers to the workflows, which is really exciting. So no surprise, Department of Energy was the first to do their integrations, but also to transition from making ORCID IDs from optional to required. And so this transition happened on October 1st. So in two situations, first, when you're an external researcher outside of the DOE applying for DOE funding, the ORCID ID is now required when you apply. And second, if you're external and you want to use one of the DOE user facilities, then when your application, you'll notice that the ORCID ID is required. So second group is the NIH, where Neil was for a long time, and Rick. So they've been a huge ORCID adopter and supporter for so very long. And as Neil said, the Science EV system is integrated with ORCID, and they've notified us that in the community that they're going to transition from making ORCID IDs optional to required in January of 26, not just in the Science EV system, but also in the ERA and NCBI systems as well. Now, we understand we've been told by these other agencies, USDA, NSF, and DoD, that all three of them have joined the ORCID consortium and they have systems that are integrated with ORCID or committing to systems that are integrated with ORCID. We're expecting them to have a greater ORCID adoption in 2026. But as we're all aware, these are changing times. And so that's why we've put the word estimate because it's we have clear intent from them, but the details we're not certain of yet. So we're waiting to hear that. But so hopefully this gives you a good context. There are more agencies adopting ORCID, but these ones are the key ones that I think most people are interested in. All right, next slide, please. So to be more clear and specific with everybody, the Science EV system has two forms that are connected or connecting with ORCID. So first is the BioSketch, and that's like the CV, the resume a researcher has to put together. And so the BioSketch form is connected to ORCID's registry. So when a researcher logs in, the data that's in their ORCID record will pre-populate the BioSketch form. So that way the researcher doesn't have to enter it in manually. They can edit the data, but they don't have to enter it, which is a big deal. So on the left column, the ORCID column, these are the data points that are mapped from an ORCID record into the BioSketch form. So education, employment, and works. So those of you who employ researchers, it's really important that you write their employment data to their ORCID record. It gets reused and recycled throughout the ORCID's infrastructure so many times, and we want to reduce administrative burden and increase the quality of data in the research ecosystem. This is one of the biggest ones. ORCID, we have just under 7,000 30,000 integrations, system integrations with ORCID's registry around the world. And so that data that you write will be recycled and reused. So please, we really, that one's one of the biggest ones. Second one that's highest in demand are works, because those citations are fussy and they're important. And so it's great to get as much data, but especially if you can write the DOI to that publication, to that expression of their research, that's really important. And again, will be reused, and you'll be decreasing the administrative burden on your researchers. The first one, education. This one's great, and we're starting some new initiatives at ORCID to increase different organizations that educate researchers to integrate with ORCID. So hopefully we'll have more for you on this in the near future. All right, next slide, please. The second form that ScienceCV provides is the current and pending other support form. Now, this form is once a researcher has received their funding and they have to do regular updates on their activities to their funder, mostly the NIH. But other agencies will be using this as well, NSF and DOE, et cetera. So this form isn't integrated with ORCID yet, but I know the ScienceCV team is working on it. Hopefully they're in the office. When they are in the office, they will be working on it. So hopefully there'll be an announcement about that soon. But there are 3 data points in the ORCID record that are mapped to this form: funding, research resources, and sure enough, employment again. So here's an example of where employment data from researchers is in incredibly high demand. And if you can write it to their record, please, please do. So the funders out there, again, you'll notice the funding that you write to the ORCID record will be recycled. So hopefully this also helps you receive good funding data. So we're all a community. The more people share and write to ORCID records, the better data you'll receive as well. So the give and take of it is mutually beneficial. The research resources, this is the non-financial contribution the researcher received. And so ORCID, we work with lots of organizations that are research facilities or host research instruments, and they can write the data about who applied for it and was awarded time at that facility or with the instrument to the ORCID record. So far, we have 3 organizations doing this: Oak Ridge National Lab, EMSL at the Berkeley National Lab, and Access, which is a NIH Center for Supercomputers. So supercomputing. And that data is being recycled into these forms, and it's being really helpful. So again, help to map the impact of data. Connecting all these data points is really important. And ORCID is the record of research activity. So the more of those data points in the ORCID record, the better we can do this work. All right, next slide, please. So we've talked about the government funders, and we also think it's really important, as Neil said, he was also with ALS and funding. And there are so many other private funders that are nonprofit that are also adopting persistent identifiers. And so we've got them listed here, and they're doing wonderful work. Now they're smaller and more agile, and they've been able to move forward better and faster. And so they've been adopting the ORCID IDs and the DOIs at an incredible rate. They're writing their funding to ORCID records with DOIs. And so they're really leading the charge, and they're showing the government agencies how it's done. And we just really want to say a big thank you to all those funders out there who on this list who are doing this excellent work. One quick note, you'll see that they're all health-related funders at this time. Paolo, next slide, please. So we'd like to encourage everyone else who provides funding to researchers to also adopt all the persistent identifiers, the ORCID IDs and the DOIs. We'd love to get funders who are outside the health sciences. We'll keep going, of course, with those who fund the health sciences researchers, but we know there are funders who fund other types of research activities. So we're really looking forward to getting them to adopt the persistent identifiers. Also, universities. We understand universities provide a tremendous amount of funding to researchers. And if those universities would like to write that funding to ORCID records, we certainly welcome that. We've also been in touch with a few pharmaceutical companies. They do a lot of funding of researchers outside, both inside their organization, but also external. And, there are some requirements for them to be transparent about their funding, and writing that to ORCID records is a really great way for them to meet those requirements of the pharmaceutical companies, and also for the researchers that receive that funding to help with that transparency and the compliance that Neil talked about earlier. And then just generally all the R&D organizations, they're government, they're nonprofit, they're commercial, all of them are certainly welcome to adopt the PID infrastructure that Neil described. All right, next slide, please. And so just to tie it all back together to what, to what Neil was saying, the benefits, gosh, improving the efficiency and reducing the administrative burden is just massive. And that just has such a huge impact on our researchers, and they really appreciate it. And then as Neil was saying, improving the tracking, the impact of the tracking and the grant impact is just so, so incredible. And I think the stories that could come out of it, of what came out of the funding, could really be strengthened if we start to track the better of what came out of this funding. The data quality and the trustworthiness of this data, once we start having those trust markers and we've got systems that can assure the person reading this data that it was written by the source of the data, usually the organization, would really help with the overall trust in science, science diplomacy. There's just nothing but benefits for it. And of course, we're doing science for a reason, and hopefully you can reach the audience that you're targeting. So also persistent identifiers help boost with the visibility and the discoverability of the research. And then as Neil also mentioned, there are new national mandates that are at the government level, federal, state, and at the funder level as well. So adopting these PIDs helps researchers comply with these new mandates. All right, I believe that's my last slide. So I'm going to hand it over to Kayla now.
Thank you so much, Shauna. So we've talked about increasing the integrity of our research funding, and we've also talked about PID adoption and the U.S. landscape specific to our funding agencies. So we know why we should use PIDs like ORCID, and we now understand a little bit more about PID adoption as a whole in the U.S. from our funders. So let's talk about the best ways we can use PIDs. And so to start us off, I'm going to walk us through the best practices and recommendations for using ORCID in funding workflows. Next slide, please. To really sort of illustrate these best practices and recommendations, we have this visual representation of the grant lifecycle and the general process of grant awards. You'll see that these sections are separated into pre-award and post-award. In pre-award, this is the step of the process where researchers, pre-awardees apply for grant funding and the funding agencies assess the researcher's activities before awarding the grant. And then at the post-award stage, this is after the awardee has received the grant, where the awardee reports back to the funding agency about their research activities, and the funder can then use that information for their assessment needs. So we're going to talk about each one of these areas and the ORCID best practices and recommendations at each stage of this process. Next slide, please. So to start, a researcher is applying for funding. At this stage of the process, a funding agency can collect their ORCID ID. ORCID, as a unique persistent identifier for people, makes it easier for a funder to distinguish researchers from each other and makes it easier to understand their research areas, activities, and their past work. One best practice is to use ORCID's OAuth process to collect a researcher's authenticated ORCID ID. And this is recommended so that the organization can collect the verified authenticated ORCID ID rather than have a researcher manually enter their ID into the application form and potentially introduce errors. We're all human, and we can make mistakes when typing information in, especially if, like many researchers, we're filling out forms constantly. So collecting ideas via the OAuth process not only reduces that administrative burden, but makes that process more quick and efficient. Next slide, please. So when an awardee connects their ORCID ID with the funding organization, they can do this if they already have an ORCID ID or if they're creating one for the first time. Many researchers already have an ORCID ID due to publisher requirements. So some funding agencies choose to require ORCID IDs when an awardee applies for grants. We just heard Shauna talk about that. And other organizations encourage awardees to include their ORCID IDs when applying for funding. But they don't make it required. So it's important to consider whether this is something your organization wants to require or not. But after connecting the ORCID ID, awardees can then authorize the funder as a trusted organization in their ORCID record. Next slide, please. Now, if a researcher, when applying for grants, has connected their ORCID ID with the funding agency, that organization can now read data from their ORCID record. This authorization allows the funder to read public and trusted parties only data in an ORCID record, so it's important to remember that researchers have full control over their ORCID record, including the privacy of that information. Through the use of ORCID's API, by authorizing organizations as trusted, the researcher can share information they do not want public to organizations by making them visible to trusted parties only, allowing those organizations to use and view that data while keeping it private to others. Next slide, please. And this is important because by connecting with the funding agency through ORCID's OAuth process, a funder can then allow the awardee to populate their applications with data from their ORCID record. And this is another best practice because researchers are already tracking their research history and activities in their ORCID record, such as other funding they've received, peer review activity they've done, and other contributions. And this is important when applying for funding, but also when the awardee is reporting back to the agency about their research and work during and after the grant period. So an awardee can also populate their progress reports with data from ORCID. Being able to allow a researcher to import data from their ORCID record into applications and reports helps them save time and keep the information they share accurate and consistent. Next slide. The next best practice or recommendation is to write funding awards to ORCID records. This helps to ensure your awardees get credit for their work and grants. When an organization writes to an ORCID record using ORCID's API, the organization will show up as the source of the records they write. This is a best practice because when an awardee applies for funding and populates forms with data from their ORCID record, funders can trust that they truly received this, for example, past funding grant, because the source and this green check mark, which is called a trust marker, is visible in the ORCID record. So trust markers further verify visibly that the organization is a trusted source, reinforcing that the information in the record is authoritative and credible. Next slide. For funders in particular, when you're writing grants to your awardees' ORCID records, you should include a grant DOI in the metadata you push. By using grant DOIs via Crossref or DataCite, for each individual award, researchers, organizations, and publications related to your funding can be more easily linked back together. It's also a best practice to include the awardee's ORCID ID in the grant DOI metadata so that everything really can link back to each other. It's a cyclical cycle, and we'll talk more about that and why it's important in a little bit. Next slide. During assessment of grant applications, many funding agencies have peer reviewers. Another best practice is collecting ORCID IDs of peer reviewers and writing peer review activity to ORCID records. Peer reviews can only be written to ORCID records via the ORCID API, which makes it even more credible and valuable to write peer review activity to ORCID records. I'll also mention that ORCID allows organizations to write both open and blind or anonymous review activity. Next slide. Now, after the grant period ends, the awardee has completed their research. Many funders want to assess how their funding has impacted their awardees' career and progress. This best practice recommendation is to use ORCID to gain insight on the progress of your awardees throughout their career. Funders who are authorized as trusted parties can view data from their awardees' records, maybe a year, 2 years, 4, to see what these researchers have done since receiving funding. Next slide. So we come back to this visualization again. At each stage of this process, ORCID can help funders reduce the administrative burden of their staff and their awardees when filling out forms and when reporting back on their research. Funders can use ORCID to help provide reliability and credibility to the data in their awardees' ORCID records and make sure both their peer reviewers and awardees are getting credit for their work and funding they received. And funders can use ORCID to assess for impact and track researchers over the course of their careers. So I mentioned before about how the research life cycle is connected. When funders use grant DOIs and included in metadata, this allows researchers, publishers, and organizations to better link back to each other and follow the progression of research. This process is made easier and more efficient through the use of persistent identifiers. And so I'm going to pass things on to Sheila to talk to you more about that.
Great, thanks, Kayla. So we've been speaking primarily about funders and ORCID so far, but I'm going to zoom out a little bit and bring the wider research ecosystem into consideration. So next slide, please. So I think, as we all know, ORCID is an identifier for people, but we also have other identifiers. We have ROR, or Research Organization Registry, which is a persistent identifier, or PID, for organizations. We have DOIs. We've already been talking about that. DOIs can be assigned to research outputs like publications and data sets, for example, but DOIs can also be assigned to grants, which we're starting to see more of. And then we also have RAID, which is a new persistent identifier for research projects, stands for the Research Activity Identifier. And these are really the most general PIDs that can be used across disciplines. I know there are other more specific PIDs out there, but these really allow us to uniquely identify all of the common entities involved in research inputs and outputs and research activity in general. So with the next slide, when all of these PIDs are used at the same time and reference each other in their metadata, we can begin to see the relationships between these entities, which can help us gain a better understanding of research activity and ultimately impact. The image on the left here shows a scenario with just a single researcher depicting the connections between the researcher, the funding they've received, the organization they're affiliated with, and their works and contributions. And the image on the right illustrates more of an aggregate and the kinds of patterns that we can start to visualize with PIDs at scale. So ORCID is very important, but the benefits of ORCID are even greater when ORCID is used alongside these other persistent identifiers. With the next slide, I think many people have probably seen this graphic before, but this is to lead us into the topic that there are multiple stakeholders that need to be involved and using PIDs in their workflows in order for everyone to realize the benefits. And when we're just looking at the ORCID-centric ecosystem here, we've got the researcher in the center with their ORCID ID and their ORCID record, and then all of the different organizations that that researcher works with, like universities, funders, and publishers, they all need to be involved in order for everyone to benefit. So let's explore those different roles in the next couple of slides. So researchers are doing their part. We've got over 10 million researchers actively using their ORCID IDs in research workflows, and awareness is increasing over time, especially as more organizations start requiring researchers to have ORCID IDs and encouraging the use of ORCID. So we're seeing that activity from researchers. Of course, there's still room for growth, but researchers are a big part of the ecosystem. Next up on the next slide, research institutions or any organization that is employing researchers. As Shauna was mentioning earlier, they're starting to write relevant information to people's ORCID records, indicating employment affiliations, education and qualifications, other types of professional activities, works in some cases. These organizations have also been often assigning DOIs to works in their repositories and using things like ROR to identify organizations in their metadata, which is great. On the next slide, as we've been talking a lot about today, of course, funders are a big part of the ecosystem. Funders are starting to assign those DOIs to individual grants and awards, and also writing funding information to ORCID records, as well as that peer review activity. So we're seeing that progress there. And then on the next slide, last but not least, in this kind of general depiction, publishers. Publishers have been assigning Crossref DOIs to journal articles and requiring ORCID IDs from authors for many years now. Scholarly publications are typically added to authors' ORCID records automatically through either Crossref or other databases, like the example you're seeing here, the NASA Astrophysics Data System. But on the next slide, I just want to highlight with this that publications and publication metadata is especially crucial for PID connectivity because it indicates the author's organizational affiliations, related works, and also funding sources. So publications are really where we're able to directly connect these outputs to the funding through the publication metadata. And the example that you're seeing here on the screen is a publication from eLife that includes a grant DOI in the publication metadata. So if we click on that grant DOI, we're taken to the image that you're seeing on the right there with the award details. And we can see that this is a grant from the International Human Frontier Science Program. They're using Proposal Central to help make these award details available. And this is really a best case scenario, and it's something that we would love to see more of, this direct connection between the grant and the output through the publication metadata there. So on the next slide, just to kind of wrap up, when all of these stakeholders are using ORCID and these other PIDs in their workflows, we can collectively build a stronger and more complete network of connected PIDs, which makes it easier to gather that information to help with assessment and help to gauge that impact. And on my final slide, to illustrate this, we have developed some resources for using publicly available data from ORCID records and publication DOIs to visualize collaborations among researchers across different organizations. Neil showed that example at the beginning of trying to map out collaborations between researchers. When all of the stakeholders are using all of these persistent identifiers together, we can gather that data a bit more easily. So in this example, we started with a list of ORCID IDs that belonged to researchers that received funding from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And this was really kind of just a proof of concept here. But from these researchers' ORCID profiles, we were able to collect publication DOIs from a certain time period. Through the publication metadata, we were able to gather information about their co-authors and then map those collaborations and what you're seeing here. So you can imagine that this map and the data behind it could be helpful for gaining a better understanding of research activity, in this case, collaborations related to a specific organization, or you could scale that up to a multiple organizations or a region. And this is just one example of the type of information we can gather when all of these relevant stakeholders are using persistent identifiers like ORCID and DOIs. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Paolo to wrap us up.
Thank you, Sheila. So now we heard a lot about things about current practices, best practices, and how to implement this. So the question now is really how can funders implement PID best practices? All right, so on the technical side, funders can adapt open infrastructures such as ORCID, DOIs, and other open infrastructures out there through system integrations. So funders can integrate using vendor systems, for example. So vendor systems with built-in functionalities, and what we're seeing here. So some of those examples include Proposal Central and Smart Simple. Both systems are ORCID certified service providers with ORCID functionalities, such as reading data from ORCID records, for example, and also pushing or writing data to ORCID. Both of these systems are also capable of handling Grant DOIs to further leverage the PID ecosystem. If, for example, you don't have a vendor system, or if your system does not have a built-in functionalities, you can always consider doing a custom integration using the API or the application programming interfaces. APIs, usually open infrastructure systems like ORCID, DataSite, Crossref, and Roar, all have APIs with them. And all of these, so each organization can use those API to connect their local system to the wider ecosystem, for example. Now, aside from the technical aspects of things, you might also want to consider other areas of your organization. So these areas can also benefit from ORCID and other PIDs. So for example, if your organization has a publishing arm, it is a best practice to implement PIDs to connect researchers, awards, and publications, which we already saw that in Sheila's presentation early on. So these helps a lot with assessment and reporting. Or outreach and promotions is also ongoing. So this never ends, right? So email, some of these examples include an email campaigns, for example, an in-person events. All of this is to really encourage researchers to connect their ORCID ID with your organization. So this gives them the benefit to make sure that all of their ORCID records are connected with the organization and that the organization can work with their ORCID records as well. So that includes pushing informations like awards that they have received. Other things to keep in mind, the ORCID US community has resources that we hope will help you think about ORCID and other PIDs in the research ecosystem. Recently, Sheila created this guide for funders. So we encourage you to take a look at this and provide feedback. So your feedback helps us make this better for everyone. So this is fairly new, so we really would like to get your input on this. So that way it can be much better for all of our stakeholders. Now, when you do receive this slide deck, we're pretty much at the tail end of things. You will also find this additional resources available in the slide deck. And this includes the articles and resources that we talked about today, as well as case studies that we may have pointed you to in this presentation, and additional resources that will be beneficial in your kind of journey throughout this process. And finally, we encourage you to reach out to us at orcidus@lyrasis.org if you have any questions and or would like to talk more about how you can implement ORCID and other PIDs in your workflows. That's what we're here for. So reach out at orcidus@lyrasis.org. And now we're going to open it up to discussions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Paolo. So I've been monitoring. We've had a few questions come in the chat during the presentation, and I have tried to put responses to those questions. I think I got to all of them. I've also seen a few questions come in through the Q&A, so maybe we can look at those because I have not responded to those that came into the Q&A. The first question has to do with adding employment information to an ORCID record. And this person is wondering how detailed a researcher should be with regard to their employment information that goes into ORCID and then maybe subsequently Science CV. For example, if a person has had various roles and different job titles at the same organization, should they articulate each role job title and the dates held, or is it sufficient to list their employer affiliation more generically and just the most recent role? I think for the question about Science CV, it would just kind of depend on what the grant is that you're applying for and the information that is the most relevant to that particular grant application. But I will say that just for keeping track of employment information on your ORCID record in general, we do recommend having a separate entry for each position that was held by that person, even if it was at the same organization, just to really be clear about, the role that person has played. If they've played multiple roles over the course of several years, it's important to have each of those as a separate entry in the ORCID record. In the interest of time, I'll move on to the second question. But also feel free to continue chiming in the chat. Okay, so the second question is, I guess for any of us that might have insight onto it, how do you see the upcoming implementation date of December 31st, 2025 for the Nelson memo, which is the federal memo to ensure immediate free public access to federally funded research, which also includes a requirement to use persistent identifiers in the metadata of that research. How do we think that implementation date coming up with that public access policy might impact changing some of the policies and processes for federal agencies? In this question, they're specifying other than NIH, but maybe also just in general. I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that as of right now. Yeah,
I can
go
jump
ahead,
in real
Sean.
So the NIH surprised us and they actually moved up their date for public access to this past summer. So it's live right now for the NIH, and everybody else I believe is for the date stated. So yeah, it's just really important to get those DOIs. Of the persistent identifiers, the DOI for the work is the top priority. But then, ORCID will be more of a secondary, but still really important. So I think in time, the ORCID ID will increase in priority for the public access. But at the moment, it's really the DOI. So get those DOIs in their ORCID records to really help everyone.
Thanks, Shauna. I'm seeing a few more questions coming in to the chat. questions related to grant DOIs, adopting grant DOIs, who issues grant DOIs. So I can speak to that. Basically, organizations need to be members of either DataCite or Crossref in order to mint DOIs, whether that's for a publication or for a grant. And so the organization, with grant DOIs in particular, the organization that is giving out the grant funding has that responsibility for creating that grant DOI for each particular award or grant that they give out. And that organization is also responsible for managing the metadata behind that grant DOI. It is then that grant DOI then needs to be passed on to the publisher or to the repository if a work that was funded by that grant gets published or submitted into a repository. And ideally, the grant DOI will be submitted so that it can be included in the publication metadata or the work metadata for example, a data set in a repository. And so it's a multi-step process. We need more funding organizations to start using grant DOIs as a standardized way of identifying and also keeping track of information about specific grants. That's one part. And then we need publishers and repositories to actively include those grant DOIs in the work metadata for the works that they're hosting. And so it's a multifaceted thing. Grant DOIs are a relatively new way of using DOIs that have only been around for maybe the past 5 years or so. It's a relatively new thing. And so we're seeing good numbers of adoption, but there's a lot more adoption that could happen there and a lot more awareness. And I think we will see increases in this as time goes on, but spreading awareness is a big part of it. I'm seeing some other comments in the chat. I'm also realizing that we are coming right up on the end of this session. Do we have any final comments from Neil or anyone else who has presented?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank all of you for all of your hard work. This is a very technical and difficult thing to do, and all the pieces are in place, all the standards are written, they've already been piloted, these systems have been shown to work. We just need more people to adopt them, and the momentum will build. But I want to remind everyone, the reason to do this is not just to have nice, neat systems, even though that makes my heart happy. The real reason to do this is to get some accuracy into our systems so we can reduce our work load on administrative stuff, spend more time on science, and then make sure we're doing the science that really get the results that we want. And the way that our funders work now, and speaking as a funder, we don't really know if we're funding things in the best way possible. Science funding is an art, it's not a science, and we need to subject ourselves to the same scientific rigor that we subject everything else, and it's hard to do without good data. And so I want to thank everyone for putting in all the time to think about how to make that data easy to use and easy to find.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those closing comments, Neil. I echo that. Thank you, everyone, for coming and spending this hour with us. We're going to continue to think about this, have these conversations. Please do email us if you have a question that didn't get answered, or if you'd like to discuss more, or get on our email list if you're not already there, so you can be part of future sessions like this. And please stay tuned for the recording, the notes, the slides. We will share all of that as soon as we can. Thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.